Private James Murphy had been in Belgium for 9 days when he stopped writing home. His last line, penned in a rain-stained notebook on December 15, 1944, read, "They say the Germans are finished. I've started planning what to do after the war." By dawn the next morning, he was digging his own grave in frozen earth. The 394th Infantry Regiment of the 99th Division held what headquarters called a quiet sector, the northern tip of the Ardennes, a place so still the men joked it felt forgotten by the war. Their outposts crouched along pine ridges near the village of Lanzerath, the trees heavy with snow that never seemed to stop falling. The veterans had been rotated out weeks earlier, what remained were boys. 19, 20. Faces too clean for combat, hands still awkward with rifles. They were told to keep their heads down and enjoy the quiet. Even the sergeant, a tired man named Coyle, said it with a shrug, this is where they hide the new guys from the real war. In the evenings, the soldiers huddled inside log bunkers they'd built themselves, stoves glowing red, coffee made from melted snow. Someone found an old radio and strung the wire to a tree. The static cleared, and Bing Crosby's voice slid through the cold, "I'll be home for Christmas." The men laughed, some joining in, their breath making ghosts in the lamplight. Outside, the forest whispered. The wind carried sounds they couldn't name, maybe branches cracking, maybe something else. But no one cared to listen too long. Murphy, the kid from Pennsylvania, carved a Christmas tree from a mess tin and nailed it to the bunker wall. If the Germans show up, he joked, at least we'll have decorations. The others laughed too hard, because laughter was the easiest armor. The supply lines were steady. The rations were dull but full. To the east, the front was said to be collapsing, but collapsing toward victory. The officers repeated the same phrase like a prayer, "They're on their last legs." The phrase sounded official enough to believe. That night, as snow piled against the door, Lieutenant Lyle Bouck sat at a field desk and filled in the logbook, "Sector quiet. Visibility limited. Morale good." He paused, listening to the steady hum of wind beyond the canvas. Somewhere, deep in the forest, a faint mechanical rumble rolled through the stillness. He waited, counting the seconds between echoes, then shook his head. Probably an Allied convoy on the Elsenborn road. He closed the book. No one noticed how warm the wind had turned, how the air carried a strange static charge, like breath held too long. The snow began to fall heavier, slower, muffling the world until the forest itself seemed to be listening. Corporal Hayes stood outside on watch, his helmet tipped back, cigarette trembling between fingers numb from the cold. He thought of home, the diner in Ohio, his wife's letter folded in his pocket, and of how the stars here looked sharper, as if war had sanded the sky clean. Then the wind shifted, and from somewhere far beyond the trees came a sound that didn't belong, a low, continuous thunder, like drums buried under ice. He flicked the cigarette away and stared into the dark. "Probably thunder," he muttered. But there were no clouds. Inside, the men played cards by lantern light. Murphy dealt the next hand, a grin on his face. "Winner gets first pass home," he said. "Loser has to stay and guard Santa." The laughter came easily, too easily, like the sound of people trying to drown out something approaching. At 2200 hours, headquarters radioed one last weather report. Cold front moving in from the east. Expect low visibility and snowfall. The sergeant repeated it aloud, shaking his head. Cold front. That's all we need. No one imagined how literal those words were. Just after midnight, the forest seemed to stop breathing. Even the snowflakes hung suspended. Then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, came the muffled growl of engines, dozens, then hundreds. Hayes pressed his ear to the frozen ground. Beneath him, the earth trembled. "Sir," he whispered into the bunker. "You feel that?" Bouck opened his eyes, listening. It was faint but steady, too synchronized to be wind. He reached for the field phone, but the line was dead, a single flat buzz. He looked around the room, 18 faces, boys half asleep, unaware that history had chosen them. "Everyone up," he said quietly. Weapons ready. Murphy rubbed his eyes, confused. What's going on? Bouck's answer came out barely above a whisper. Something's coming. Outside, a red flare bloomed over the horizon, reflected in the ice like blood under glass. Then came another, and another, until the treetops burned with color. Murphy stepped out of the bunker, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He stared toward the east. The horizon glowed orange, not from dawn but from fire. He turned back toward the others. That's not thunder, he said. A second later, the ground erupted. Shells screamed overhead, tearing the trees into splinters. The shockwave threw him backward, snow turning instantly to steam. Voices shouted in the chaos, incoming. Then vanished beneath the roar. In his journal, found later among the ruins, the next line was short, jagged, scrawled in pencil pressed so hard it cut the paper, "They're not finished." And at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, the Ardennes stopped being quiet. The earth itself began to speak, and its language was artillery. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The first shell landed half a mile away, just enough for the men to think it was a mistake. The second one landed closer. By the time the third came, the entire forest lit up, and any illusion of safety burned with it. It was 5:30, December 16, 1944. The opening move of Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive. To the men of the 394th Infantry, it felt like the world itself was tearing open. Private James Murphy hit the frozen floor of the trench, the air punched from his lungs. Snow and dirt rained down, stinging like needles. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted, but his words vanished into the thunder. 1,000 German guns were firing at once, howitzers, mortars, Nebelwerfers. The sound wasn't a rhythm, it was a single, endless roar. The sky turned orange, then black, then orange again, as if the sun itself couldn't decide whether to rise or die. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck pressed his helmet tighter, listening to the fragments of reports crackling through the static. Artillery across the whole sector. Lines cut. Then the voice vanished, eaten by interference. The field phone was dead again. They were alone. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Somewhere behind him, a man screamed for a medic. The forest was a storm of fire and metal. And yet, between explosions, there were moments of silence so complete they felt unreal. In those seconds, Bouck could hear his own heartbeat, and underneath it, the low, growing rumble of engines. Tanks. He crawled to the lip of the trench and peered through the snow. Nothing but fog and smoke. But the vibrations deep in the earth didn't lie. "Get ready," he said quietly. Murphy looked up, face gray with fear. "Ready for what?" Bouck's answer came slow, steady. "Whatever's coming next." When the barrage finally lifted, it left a silence more terrifying than the noise. Men climbed out of the craters, coughing, ears bleeding. Half their communications gear was gone. The radio operator, Corporal Fields, twisted the dials again and again, whispering like a priest at confession. No signal, nothing. In the valley below, something moved, dark shapes gliding through the fog. They looked like ghosts until the light caught steel. "Panzer tanks," said Sergeant Coyle, voice flat. "And a lot of them." Bouck checked his map. According to headquarters, there shouldn't have been any German armor within 20 miles. According to the real world, there were dozens. He folded the map and shoved it into his pocket. So much for headquarters. The men scrambled to their positions, setting up the 30 caliber machine gun, loading what little ammunition they had left. Murphy's hands shook as he clipped the belt in. "You think anyone else is still holding?" Bouck didn't answer. He could see the distant flashes, artillery slamming into positions all along the ridge. The quiet sector was gone. Through the fog, they could now make out the silhouettes of soldiers advancing, columns of gray uniforms moving with precision. The 1st Parachute Division of the Luftwaffe. Elite. Experienced. They moved like they'd done this 100 times before. Jesus, whispered one of the men. They're sending paratroopers at us. They're sending everything, Bouck said. The first machine gun burst cut across the valley, a line of fire stitching through the snow. The Germans scattered, then regrouped, returning fire. Bullets hissed over their heads, snapping branches. Bouck's men held steady. When the first squad of Germans crossed the open field, the Americans opened up, controlled bursts, methodical, every round counting. The snow erupted around the attackers. Bodies fell. Others dropped and crawled forward. The ground was too frozen to dig foxholes, the dead became their cover. Murphy reloaded, shouting over the gunfire. They keep coming. That's their job, Bouck shouted back. Ours is to make them regret it. Another shell exploded near the road, sending debris raining down. One of the men, Private Klein, was thrown backward, helmet spinning away. Bouck crawled over, dragging him into the trench. The kid's eyes were open, glassy. Bouck closed them with a gloved hand and moved on. There was no time for prayers. Hours passed like minutes, the battle folding into itself, smoke, screams, the endless rattle of guns. The Germans attacked again and again, convinced they were facing an entire American battalion. They had no idea it was only 18 men. At noon, the sky turned the color of iron. The Germans paused their advance, regrouping behind the tree-line. For the first time all day, the Americans could breathe. Bouck used the lull to take stock, 2 dead, 5 wounded, ammunition running low. Coyle leaned against the wall of the trench, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. We can't hold much longer. Bouck looked at the men, faces hollow with exhaustion. We hold until we can't. Then we hold anyway. The sergeant exhaled smoke, half a laugh caught in his throat. Sir, that's not in the manual. Bouck's reply was simple. Neither is what's coming. He didn't know that across the front, whole divisions were collapsing under the same onslaught. That American lines were folding, towns falling, roads clogged with retreating troops. All he knew was the patch of snow and mud around Lanzerath, and the men still alive in it. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped. The fog thickened, swallowing the world. From beyond the ridge came the grinding sound of tank treads again, closer now. Murphy wiped frost from his rifle and whispered, "What if they break through?" Bouck's voice was steady, almost calm. "Then we make sure they remember who stopped them first." In the distance, a flare rose, a red bloom in the dark sky. Then came the whistle of incoming shells. The second wave was starting. He looked down the trench, catching each man's eye. No orders left to give, no maps left to read. Only this. "Dig in," he said. The next explosion swallowed the rest of his words. And somewhere in that burning forest, 18 men became the line between chaos and collapse. Dawn broke gray over the frozen hills, a thin light bleeding through the trees. The snow had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the shellfire. For a moment, the forest looked almost calm, until you noticed the blackened stumps, the craters, the twisted metal jutting from the earth like bones. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck stood at the edge of the trench, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Below, the road to Lanzerath wound through the pines, quiet now but scarred by tracks and corpses. His men, what was left of them, were already awake, though none had really slept. 18 soldiers. That was all he had. 18 men standing between 2 German divisions and the open road to the coast. Private James Murphy sat beside the .30 caliber machine gun, feeding a belt of ammunition through numb fingers. His gloves were stiff with ice. They said this sector was quiet, he muttered. Bouck didn't look away from the glass. It was. What changed? The war caught up. The radio operator, Fields, was twisting knobs again, begging the silence for a signal. Static. Just static, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. The wind hissed through the pines. Somewhere far below, an engine revved. Then another. Bouck lowered the binoculars. Positions. They're coming. Through the mist, gray shapes moved like shadows, lines of German paratroopers, hundreds of them, stepping in rhythm. Their helmets glinted faintly in the half-light. Behind them, the rumble of armor, the deep mechanical heartbeat of tanks. Murphy swallowed hard. There's no way that's all for us. Coyle, the sergeant, gave a grim smile. Guess we're popular. Bouck crouched low, voice calm but firm. No one fires until they're in the open. Make every shot count. The first wave reached the clearing, crunching over the snow. The men in gray were confident, casual, they'd been told this ridge was empty. Then the hillside erupted. Machine guns tore the quiet apart. Bullets chewed through the white drifts, kicking up fountains of red. German soldiers dropped where they stood, the survivors scattering for cover. For 5 minutes straight, the 394th Recon Company fought like an entire regiment. Murphy shouted over the noise, they're falling back. Let them. Bouck yelled. They'll be back. When the smoke cleared, the field below was littered with motionless shapes. Bouck checked his men. One wounded, nothing fatal. For now. They reloaded in silence. Steam rose from the gun barrels. The smell of cordite hung thick and metallic. Murphy wiped his face with a trembling hand. How long you think we can keep this up? Bouck didn't answer. The next attack came half an hour later, mortars this time, the whistling death that turned the forest into a storm. Trees exploded in showers of splinters. Dirt rained down. A nearby blast hurled Murphy against the trench wall. His ears rang, the world went silent except for his own heartbeat. He blinked, saw Bouck crawling toward him, shouting words he couldn't hear. When his hearing came back, it was full of screams. Ammo, someone yelled. They're flanking left. Bouck moved along the trench, shouting orders, keeping them firing in short, controlled bursts. Don't waste a round. Make it sound like there's more of us. Every trigger pull was a lie, every explosion an illusion. The Germans believed they faced a full company. They didn't know it was barely a squad. By midday, the snow was churned to mud. The Germans attacked again, 200 men charging straight up the hill. The Americans waited until they were close enough to see their faces, then unleashed everything they had left. The hillside became a furnace. When the smoke thinned, the attack had vanished. Coyle reloaded with shaking hands. That's the third wave. What's next? Bouck's voice was steady. The fourth. They all laughed then, a short, bitter sound. It was easier than thinking about what came after. As the day dragged on, ammunition ran low. The radio was still dead. The temperature dropped. Breath froze in the air. One man tried to light a cigarette, his hands trembling so hard the match broke in two. Murphy leaned back against the trench, eyes half closed. Sir, are we really holding them off? Bouck nodded slowly. For now. Every hour we hold, someone else gets to live. The word steadied them. Even exhaustion couldn't drown that kind of meaning. At dusk, the Germans regrouped for one last push. Mortar fire rained down again, closer than ever. A shell landed directly in front of the trench, throwing snow and metal in every direction. When the smoke cleared, one of the men was gone. Bouck didn't flinch. Hold the line. They did. Somehow, through sheer stubbornness, they did. When darkness fell, the firing stopped. The Germans pulled back, leaving the field eerily quiet. The survivors slumped in their positions, too tired to move, too numb to speak. Murphy looked out across the valley. The snow had started again, covering the bodies, erasing the evidence of what they'd done. Think they'll come back, he whispered. Bouck didn't look up. They always come back. The men stared into the dark, waiting. The wind carried the faint sound of boots crunching through the snow, slow, deliberate, close. Coyle raised his rifle. Movement. Bouck peered into the fog. Dozens of silhouettes were advancing, rifles slung, helmets low. For one heartbeat, he thought they might be Americans. Then a voice called out, sharp and guttural, unmistakably German. He exhaled, shoulders squaring. Get ready. Murphy's hands tightened on his weapon. Sir, we're out of ammo. Bouck didn't hesitate. Then we fight with what we've got left. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the last light. Somewhere ahead, a bolt slid forward with a metallic click. And the Battle of Lanzerath began all over again. By noon, the ridge at Lanzerath looked more like the edge of another planet. Smoke drifted across the snow, the air stinking of cordite and blood. The trench was half collapsed, its walls frozen and slick. Of the original 18 men, only a dozen could still fight. Their rifles steamed in the cold, bolts clicking like metronomes in a song that never stopped. Private Murphy crouched beside the machine gun, hands shaking so badly he could barely feed the belt. They're everywhere, he shouted. We're surrounded. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck didn't even look up. Good, he said flatly. Now we can shoot in any direction. A laugh broke through the noise, short, breathless, insane. For a heartbeat, it felt like humor. Then the next shell landed. The German paratroopers came in waves, gray figures moving through the smoke like ghosts, rifles low, eyes black with frost. The .30 caliber opened up, spitting fire, and the hillside answered with screams. The enemy dropped, scattered, crawled for cover. Then another wave followed. Short bursts. Bouck shouted. Make them think there's a company here. They fired in rhythm, 4 seconds of chaos, 10 of silence. The illusion worked. From the forest came shouted orders in German, the sound of retreating boots crunching through snow. For the first time in hours, the trench was quiet except for breathing. Murphy stared out at the white field littered with bodies. Sir, he said softly, they'll come back. Bouck nodded. Good. Let them waste their time on us. The next attack came at 1. Mortars dropped into the valley, turning snow into mud. The blasts came closer, one, then another, then a direct hit that threw dirt and limbs across the trench. When the smoke cleared, 2 men were gone. Ammo check. Coyle yelled. Down to 2 clips, someone answered. Bouck's voice stayed steady. Make every shot count. They fired single rounds now, slow, deliberate, each bullet measured like breath. The machine gun fell silent. When it jammed, they didn't have time to fix it. Murphy switched to his rifle and kept firing until his shoulder went numb. Hours passed in fragments, bursts of noise, seconds of eerie calm. The snow kept falling, covering the blood before it could freeze. Every few minutes, a German voice would call out, trying to make them surrender. No one answered. At 3, the Germans tried to flank them from the left. Bouck saw it coming, sent 2 men crawling through the wreckage to cut them off. The first died halfway there. The second made it, dropped a grenade, and never came back. When it was over, the trench was quieter than ever. Bouck leaned against the wall, his face gray with exhaustion. We're not holding a hill anymore, he murmured. We're holding time. Fields, the radio man, laughed weakly. Time for what? For everyone else to wake up. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of wind moving through the broken trees. Then, faintly, the snow began to tremble. Murphy frowned. You feel that? It wasn't the sharp pounding of mortars, this was deeper, slower. A vibration in the ground. Branches above them shook, spilling snow into the trench. Coyle glanced toward the treeline. Probably trucks, he said, but his voice didn't believe it. The vibration grew heavier. The sound now was unmistakable, the metallic growl of engines, the creak of treads on frozen soil. Bauck lifted his binoculars. Through the drifting snow, he saw a dark shape sliding out of the forest. Then another. And another. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. "Panzer," he said quietly. The word hit harder than the shells. Murphy's hands froze on the rifle. "Sir, we don't have anything for that." Bauck lowered the binoculars. His face was calm, almost peaceful. "Then we make them think we do." They spread what ammo was left, maybe 20 rounds between them. The air grew thick with the smell of oil and smoke. The first tank crawled closer, its turret sweeping side to side. The snow shook with each turn of its treads. "Single shots," Bauck said. "Aim for the slits. Make every bullet count." Murphy raised his rifle. The steel beast filled his scope, black cross, narrow slit, a monster built for no man to stop. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bullet pinged harmlessly off armor. The tank didn't even slow down. It rolled forward, crushing its own dead beneath the treads. The noise drowned everything, shouting, shooting, prayers. One of the men hurled a grenade that bounced off and disappeared into the snow. Nothing. Patterson grabbed a mortar shell, yanked the fuse, and threw it like a football. It vanished under the tank and didn't explode. He laughed, wild and broken. "Guess it's a dud, boys." Bauck shouted something, but the roar of the Panzer swallowed his voice. The trench shook as the machine rolled closer. Snow and dirt collapsed around them. Murphy fired his last round. The click afterward was louder than the shot. He looked at Bauck. "That's it." The lieutenant nodded once. His breath fogged in the air. "Then that's all we needed to do." At 1600 hours, they were still there. The ridge still stood. The Germans had lost more than 100 men trying to take a hill held by 18. The tanks lined up at the forest's edge, their guns turning in unison. And from somewhere in the white haze, a voice screamed the word everyone feared, one that sounded like the end of the world itself. "Panzer." The first tremor came through the ground, a low vibration, heavy and sure. Snow slid from branches, birds fled in silence. Then, from the forest, came the groan of gears. The Panther appeared first, its gun searching the smoke. Behind it, a Tiger tank lumbered forward, black cross faint under frost. Lieutenant Lyle Bauck raised his binoculars, lowered them again, and said quietly, "Positions. Slits and optics only. Make them think we still bite." Private Murphy wiped the ice from his sight and waited until the beast filled it. He fired. The shot pinged off steel and vanished into snow. The tank didn't even flinch. "Grenade," someone yelled. The explosion bloomed uselessly beside the hull, a puff of white on gray. The Panther advanced, grinding the frozen earth flat, swallowing fences, trees, and the last pieces of the trench. The Tiger's coaxial gun rattled, tearing apart the lip of the foxhole. One soldier went down with a sound like air escaping. Bauck grabbed him by the collar, felt the weight change, and let go. There was no time to look back. Then Patterson, wild-eyed, bleeding from the ear, grabbed a mortar shell, yanked the fuse cap with his teeth, and hurled it like a football. It thumped under the tank and didn't explode. He laughed, high and cracked. "Guess we're out of miracles, boys. Scatter and regroup." Bauck shouted. The survivors crawled through gaps in the trench, snow up to their knees. Bullets hissed like insects. A shell hit nearby, blowing apart a barn and the cow inside it. The air filled with straw and ash. They regrouped in the ruins of a farmhouse. The roof sagged, frost clung to the broken beams. Murphy loaded his last 3 rounds. "We're out of ammo, sir." Bauck checked his watch. The second hand trembled. "Then shoot slow. Make them think we've got all day." They did, single, patient shots that answered the tank's roaring advance. Coyle hit a German officer who'd stepped too far ahead, the man folded wordlessly into the snow. For a moment, the field went still. The tanks halted, smoke rising from their exhausts. Then they began again, moving like hunger given form. The trench behind them was gone, crushed into memory. The ridge was lost, but not their defiance. A shell landed nearby. Murphy hit the ground hard, ears ringing. When he looked up, he saw Fields, the radio man, clutching the useless transmitter, whispering something to it before slumping over. Murphy reached for him, but Fields was already still. Bouck shouted orders over the chaos. Left flank. Move. They slid through snow, across the shattered square, into what had once been a street. The Tigers tracked them slowly, guns turning like eyes. The first blast hit the bell tower. It folded in on itself, spilling bronze and dust into the cold. They ducked behind a low wall, 7 men now. Faces gray, hands raw. That all of us? Coyle asked. Bouck nodded once. That's enough. From the haze ahead, German voices echoed, sharp, commanding. Then came the order, repeated and closer, hand hoch. Hands up. The Americans looked at each other. None moved. Finally, Bouck exhaled and said softly, "We've done what we came to do." He stood, raising both hands. One by one, the others followed. The Germans moved in cautiously, weapons ready, but their faces showed something like respect. A Luftwaffe officer approached, tall, frost clinging to his cap. He studied the ruins, the bodies, the impossible resistance. "You were only a patrol?" he asked in careful English. Bouck nodded. 18 men. The officer gave a short, disbelieving laugh. 18. He looked around again, then said in German to his soldiers, almost to himself, Wort verrückt, oder Helden. You were mad, or heroes. They were searched, disarmed, and led away past the wreckage. The tank still rumbled behind them, heading west, slower now, delayed, their advance wounded. As they marched, Murphy glanced back once. The ridge they'd held was no longer a hill, just smoke and churned snow. But in the distance, he thought he heard the dull, rhythmic thunder of American artillery. A sound that hadn't been there before. Coyle caught his eye. You hear that? Murphy nodded, smiling through cracked lips. Yeah. Sounds like we bought M some time. No one answered. They just kept walking, boots crunching on ice, the sound of battle fading behind them. They had lost everything, their weapons, their position, their freedom. But as the sky darkened, Bouck looked back once more at the burning ridge. They'll remember this ground, he said quietly. Even if no one remembers us. And in that frozen ruin, the world's most powerful army had been stopped, by 18 men, and the will not to move. December 18, 1944. The Ardennes forest had gone silent again, the kind of silence that follows exhaustion, not peace. Snow fell in thin, lazy sheets, drifting over craters and broken trees, covering what was left of Lanzerath as if the earth itself wanted to forget. Miles to the west, the sound of American artillery began to rise, a steady, organized rhythm, not the desperate chaos of days before. For the first time since the offensive began, the shells were heading east. At the front of a German convoy, an officer studied a map smeared with mud. They should have been here yesterday, he muttered. The column had lost nearly a full day fighting ghosts, a handful of men they'd mistaken for an entire battalion. That delay would echo all the way to Berlin. Behind those German lines, on the other side of the ridge, new American units were arriving. Trucks, half-tracks, and tanks creaked through the snow toward the Elsenborn line. Men jumped out, stamping their boots, hauling ammunition crates. The cold bit through everything, but the atmosphere was different, something fragile had shifted. Colonel McClernand of the 99th Division stood beside his jeep, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The air was thick with smoke and snow, yet his voice carried. Because those kids held, he said, we can fight back. A nearby sergeant didn't know who he meant. He didn't need to. Everyone had heard rumors, a small patrol east of the ridge that had fought like a full company. Nobody believed it at first. But the evidence was there in the bodies, the wrecked vehicles, the reports from captured Germans who spoke of heavy American resistance at Lanzerath. In the field headquarters that night, a radio operator repeated the news over static, enemy advance delayed. Allied lines stabilizing. Repeat, Elsenborn Ridge is holding. And somewhere far away, in a barn turned into a makeshift prison, Lieutenant Lyle Bouck heard the same words in translation. He was seated on the cold floor, wrists tied with wire, eyes half shut from exhaustion. Snow drifted through holes in the roof. Around him sat the survivors, Murphy, Coyle, Patterson, and the rest who had not been buried by the tanks. Their faces were blank, unreadable, not from fear anymore, but from having spent everything already. A German guard entered with a lantern. "Food," he said, setting down a pot of thin soup. The men barely moved. Bouck looked up, voice hoarse. "How far to the front?" The guard hesitated. "The front?" He shrugged. "Moving backward, maybe." Then he left, locking the door behind him. Murphy laughed quietly, a dry, humorless sound. "Guess we slowed them down after all." Bouck didn't answer. He was listening. Outside, beyond the wind, came a deep, distant thunder, the American guns at Elsenborn. It was a sound like breathing returning to a body. 3 days earlier, those guns hadn't been there. Now the entire First Army was dug in behind them. General Hodges wrote in his field report, "The stand of the 394th Reconnaissance Platoon may have saved this front." It was a single sentence buried between logistics and fuel shortages, but it meant everything. By dawn, the forest shook under the weight of counterfire. The ground trembled again, this time from friendly artillery. Shells streaked overhead, their trails glowing orange against the gray sky. The ridge was no longer a trap, it was a fortress. McClernand walked the new line, men saluting as he passed. "You hear that?" he asked one of his sergeants. "That's the sound of a turning tide." The sergeant nodded, rubbing frost from his rifle. "Sir, what happened out east?" The colonel's voice softened. "A handful of kids refused to move. So now the rest of us can." In the POW barn, Bouck leaned against the wall, letting his head rest on the rough timber. He didn't sleep, just drifted in and out of the kind of half-consciousness where memory feels too close to touch. He saw again the ridge, the smoke, the snow burning red under tracer fire. He heard Murphy's voice saying, "We're surrounded," and his own reply, "Good. Now we can shoot in any direction." He wondered if anyone would ever know what had really happened, how long they'd held, how many had fallen, how a single patrol had made the German timetable bleed. By nightfall, the guards whispered nervously among themselves. They could hear the artillery now, closer, constant. One muttered, "Die American are coming." "The Americans are coming." Bouck smiled faintly in the dark. It wasn't triumph. It was relief. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the ridge again, layer by layer, erasing the black scars of explosions, the lines of boots, the blood. But beneath that silence, something had changed forever. The ridge that had been just another name on a map was now a hinge in history. And in that frozen barn, among exhausted men with no medals and no witnesses, a quiet truth settled: they had held long enough for the world to catch up. When morning came, the prisoners were marched deeper into Germany. As they passed through the ruins of Lanzerath, Bouck looked back once. The ridge stood there under the pale winter sun, smoke curling up like breath. It was gone, and it remained, a scar carved into snow and time. He whispered, barely audible, "We didn't lose. We just ran out of bullets." Behind them, the guns kept roaring, and the sound rolled through the forest like a promise that the line, their line, would never fall again. When the war finally ended, it did not stop with a single explosion or a flag. It simply ran out of breath. The men of the 394th came home quietly, scattered like leaves after a storm. There were no reporters waiting, no medals waiting on desks. They returned to towns that had already learned how to forget. Murphy found work in a hardware store in Ohio. He liked counting bolts and nails, small, predictable things. Coyle became a bus driver in Pennsylvania. He said he preferred roads where you always knew where the turns were. Patterson married a nurse he met at a veterans hospital. She asked about his medals once. He laughed and said, "They're still somewhere in Belgium." Bouck, the lieutenant, went back to college, earned a degree, and spent his life avoiding questions that began with, "Tell me about." When people asked about the Ardennes, they gave short answers. "Cold," said Murphy. "Loud," said Coyle. Bouck's answer was always the same, "We did our job." He never added that doing their job had meant standing alone against an army. The first histories of the Battle of the Bulge came out a year later. Thick books, filled with arrows and maps. Lanzerath was a dot. The words 394th Reconnaissance Platoon appeared once, near the margin. The official line read, "Small American patrol delayed enemy advance for several hours." Those hours, no one realized, had been everything. For decades, the story slept. The men aged. Knees stiffened, hearing faded, and nightmares lost their sharp edges, becoming dull background noise. Murphy still woke before dawn every December, made coffee, and stared out at the snow. He couldn't say why. Coyle's hands shook when buses hit potholes in winter. Bouck kept a folded map in a drawer that he never opened, except once, to show his son where the ridge had been. It might have stayed forgotten, just another small battle swallowed by a larger war, if not for a schoolteacher in the 1980s who stumbled upon a German document in a stack of declassified files. The paper mentioned strong American resistance near Lanzerath. 18 men. A delay of nearly a full day. Enough time for the U.S. First Army to dig in along Elsenborn Ridge. The teacher wrote letters to veterans groups, historians, anyone who would listen. A young researcher traced the names, Bouck, Murphy, Coyle, Patterson. She found them in quiet suburbs and nursing homes. When she asked Bouck how many men he'd had, he said, 18. When she asked how many Germans, he smiled faintly, too many. The more the researchers dug, the clearer it became. The Germans had believed they were facing a full regiment. Their reports described heavy American artillery, multiple machine gun nests, and organized resistance. None of it had existed. Just a handful of soldiers and the belief that falling back was not an option. In 2001, 57 years later, the surviving men of the 394th were invited to Washington. The hall was bright, polished, sterile. Bouck wore his old uniform jacket, it was too tight at the shoulders. The general presenting the awards read each name carefully, as if afraid the syllables might break. Distinguished Unit Citation, a ribbon decades overdue. When it was Bouck's turn, he shook the general's hand and whispered, "Thank you, sir." Murphy stood beside him, tears in his eyes. Coyle laughed under his breath, the same cracked laugh from the ridge. Reporters asked how it felt to be heroes. Coyle said, "We weren't heroes. We just didn't leave." That night, in a hotel room overlooking the Capitol, the men sat together for the first time in years. They drank bad coffee, not whiskey. Medication didn't mix well with alcohol anymore. They spoke about nothing important, weather, football, the ache in their backs. No one mentioned the ridge. They didn't need to. Back in Belgium, the snow fell over Lanzerath as it always had. The forest had grown back, the scars hidden beneath moss and roots. But if you walked there in winter, you could still see faint depressions in the earth, lines of trenches where 18 young men had decided that retreat was not an option. A granite marker stood at the edge of the field now, engraved in English and German. Here, on December 16 to 17, 1944, a small American platoon held this ground against overwhelming odds. School groups came sometimes. The guide would tell the story, 18 against hundreds, holding for nearly a full day, and the children would listen in silence. One would always ask, did they win? The guide's answer was simple: they didn't have to. They just had to hold. In Ohio, Murphy's grandson keeps a small box on his dresser. Inside is a ribbon, a photograph of 18 men squinting against the snow, and a quote written in faded ink: "We didn't lose. We just ran out of bullets." They were not heroes by profession. They were ordinary men who stood their ground when the world around them collapsed. The war ended far away from their ridge, in places with larger names and louder victories. But for those 18, on that frozen hill, time stopped long enough for history to catch its breath. And because they held, the world kept turning.